Hi, everybody. Welcome back. For those of you who've been following along, for those of you who have been following along, this is about the time I start to apologize for our repetitive intro. But I thank you for your patience as we run through some introductions and set some sort of just important context. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley, and I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, or CMI for short. And I'm joined here today with Marcy Marr and Kendall Benish from the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP for short. So CMI and KCP have joined forces again for this series of our CRUD Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's Winter Webinar Series. It's our KCP's 10th season and CMI's 8th season of CRUD Talks. But before we really get started, I'd like to just pause for a second and acknowledge that the region in which both of our organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Shuswap, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and living things since time immemorial. So as we have been doing, I invite you to open your chat and introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, perhaps who you are working with if you feel like that's relevant, and also the Indigenous territories that you're zooming in from today. And as you do that, I'll continue to introduce the series. So this season of webinars explores the theme of wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity. We're welcoming 8 speakers who will discuss this theme from different perspectives to provide what is a wide view to inform the conservation of connected and resilient landscapes across the Columbia Basin. This year's series is financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust and also LGL Limited. Many thanks to both of those organizations for allowing us to offer this series free of charge. And most importantly, thanks to all of you who have been joining and following along. Today is our 6th webinar, and we'll be welcoming Rob Ament, Senior Conservationist at the Center for Large Landscapes Conservation. He will show us how different countries on 6 continents are all tackling the common issue of making roads more permeable and less lethal for wildlife. He'll cover a variety of taxa that will focus on crossing designs from arboreal primates, large herbivores, and meso-carnivores to birds and reptiles. But before we go there, I'm just going to tell you really briefly about CMI. So CMI is a nonprofit society and an association for people working in various fields of ecology. We provide professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, and webinars, of course, and we address everything from skill-based research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website is a great place to learn more about the things we do, and it contains really great resources such as proceeding documents and recordings from talks like this. So what I would like to do now is pass it over to Marcy Marr, who's going to tell you a little bit about KCP.
Hello, everyone. As Haley said, I'm Marcy Marr, and I'm joining you on behalf of the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP. And we're a diverse network of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, federal, provincial, and local governments, First Nations, land trusts, agricultural producers, and educational institutions who all contribute to conserving our region. The purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve and steward landscapes that sustain biodiversity and naturally functioning ecosystems, and to generate the support and resources needed to achieve this effort, including building technical knowledge in webinars like this. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar series again with CMI, and would like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we would not be able to support this type of work. So now just a couple of housekeeping details and we'll get started. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar to add a question to the queue, and we'll do our best to make our way through them. And you can also use the upvote button in the Q&A. So if you see a question that's similar to yours or that you'd also like to see answered, please press the thumbs up icon by that question. Okay, and back to you, Haley.
Thanks, Marcy. All right, so now the moment you've been waiting for, I would like to introduce Rob Ament. I have a short bio I'd like to read, and then I'll pass it off to him. So Rob is a senior conservationist at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, as I said earlier. He's a member of the IUCN's Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, and under its auspices, he is the co-chair of the Transport Working Group and its Asian Elephant Transport Working Group. He has been active in road ecology research, policy, and implementation for 25 years, both in North America and internationally. We're really lucky to have snagged some of Rob's time today. Rob, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. I'll get my screen shared here. Hang on just a moment. There we go. Thank you, Haley. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about international efforts. And I'll try to talk a bit about how Canada has influenced the world. And hopefully now you'll get a chance to see how the world may influence you in your future endeavors. So I will just move right through the presentation now. What we have is the world is filled with roads, over 33 million kilometers when you look at both paved and unpaved. So the issue is that not only do we have a lot of fragmented landscapes right now, but the future is going to increase even more. So since the turn of the century, we've added 12 million kilometers, and as you can see, 25 more are being projected. 90% of the development of these roads are in developing countries, where often intact landscapes are seeing their first roads and railways. While, as you know, in North America and Europe, we're pretty much adding more lanes to our existing infrastructure. And I will cover a little bit on rails as well as roads, and they too are being expanded greatly. And of course, the benefits are for economic development, and countries do want to invest in their infrastructure. So what we're trying to do is balance those needs for socioeconomic development with the protection of biodiversity and ecological connectivity. And this is where I always share with people around the world is why the case for wildlife crossings. When you look at their effectiveness in reducing, in this case, this came from a paper we did back in 2009 when I was at the Western Transportation Institute. Tony Clevenger from Canada, as well as Marcel Hauser from WTI, was the lead author. This came out of our national study here in the US. This has subsequently been updated in 2021, but a publication in a journal hasn't come out yet. But you can see that there are effective ways to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, such as animal detection systems, fencing alone, or fencing with small gaps with animal detection systems. They get you in the 80 percentile, but they don't improve ecological connectivity. And often the animal detection systems only detect large animals, so you're not providing connectivity or reducing mortality for medium and smaller animals. And so thus, what is highly effective and what maintains or improves ecological connectivity? It's the underpasses and the overpasses with fencing. So that's why they are being promoted all across the globe, and most agencies are implementing such structures, and that's what I'll be presenting today. The other paper that's really important about the fencing that goes with the structures. This again was my colleague Marcel Hauser published it. And if you have the structures and leave them by themselves with no fences, the variability is quite high, from 0 to 94%. So sometimes they will be highly effective if it's the only place where animals can cross the road. But if not, they can go down to 0% effectiveness. And so that's why fencing, and not just short little guiding fences, but a longer fence, increases the effectiveness from around 50% back up to greater than 80%. So again, we always talk about crossing structures, but we also try to point out that it's always with fencing if you want to maintain effectiveness. And so this is now being established across the world. The very first group to focus on ecological connectivity at the IUCN was established just in 2016. And the president of my organization, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, Gary Tabor, is the chair. And so as a result of being the chair of the IUCN's connectivity group, we provide its secretariat. Basically, we staff it for 1,200 members, all volunteers on all the continents. And there are many different specialist groups, but you can see we sort of sit under the the World Commission on Protected Areas. So we don't have a broad term of reference, but we have our working group for transportation is focused on ecological connectivity and to help managers of protected and conserved areas address linear infrastructure. So then just 1 year later, the CCSG, the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, formed the Transport Working Group. They said one of the biggest barriers to connectivity is transportation. We need some expertise on that. And so that was formed. I'm a co-chair along with Rod Vanderie out of Australia. We have 100 members, and we were to provide advice on policy science. You can see the terms of reference to the CCSG. And so the Transport Working Group published our first, it took us 4 years. We had over 40 contributors to this publication. And of course, IUCN published it, and it just came out in last July. And we did our first webinar 2 days ago. So this is very timely, and we're starting to promote the results of the technical report. And we're quite pleased with the response we're getting across the world. And so we know that providing advice just globally often is not very context sensitive. So we are experimenting with 2 subgroups in our Transport Working Group. One is species specific, and that's the Asian elephant Transport Working Group. And one is sort of sub-regional, the Latin America, Caribbean Transport Working Group. They conduct their meetings primarily in Spanish and Portuguese. So we have these 2 groups, and they're continuing the work of the larger group. And this is an example of the first publication that came out of the Asian Elephant Transport Working Group. It was formed in 2019, and by 2021, we did an introduction. And in 2 weeks, our second publication, which is a handbook, which will actually have designs and recommendations of sizing and spacing, et cetera, for wildlife crossings for Asian elephants. So now I want to talk about, so that's the sort of international organization, and it's open for you to join. You can contact the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and we can get you membership if you're interested in this more international effort. But I always tell people, again, because I worked at the Western Transportation Institute, and Tony Clevenger was staff when I was staff there, and he did a lot of the research in Banff, and all the lessons learned about crossings and much of the information that inspired the rest of the world really came out of Canada, which was quite great. I mean, you were the leaders in the world on this, and really he gave presentations. It's amazing the amount of people from different countries that wanted to visit Banff for their crossings. And as you know, it was a whole suite. It wasn't one simple type of design. But I always call the overpass the double eyebrow design with the head wall and then the rocks piled in front. But that's unique, and I want to show you some of different aesthetics when it comes to wildlife crossings from different parts of the world. So here are some examples. The top left, that is China's. This is an overpass, but actually it's a tunnel. But you can tell you're not in Banff when you see designs such as that. The one on the top right is from Spain in a grassland. And so you can see how they're trying to design to have things fit into their environment. The bottom right is Bhutan, which is a very interesting design for an underpass with the blocks across it on the top where the traffic passes. And then on the left, which is more traditional that we're more familiar with, would be from Argentina, an overpass. So as you can see, the aesthetics change as you move around, and it's quite interesting as you travel and look at how these designs are being implemented. I also want to talk about Mexico, our third member of North America, and they're just starting to pick up this whole notion of road ecology and wildlife crossings. And Tony Clevenger, that's the person on the left with our two Mexican colleagues, we were able to attend and present at their very first workshop on road ecology. I think it was in 2017. So again, they are just getting started. And 2 years later, I was invited to Guadalajara. 300 civil engineers get together and are finally starting to talk about this. They're getting really excited about starting to design their highway systems so they're more sustainable and providing ecological connectivity. I met a fellow who was a consultant at this conference. There was no field trip. And then he takes me out on the road outside Guadalajara. And he says, yeah, I'm the consultant studying the wildlife crossings. I said, oh, we didn't even have a field trip planned for this conference. And so he said, well, I'll take you. And here we are on this new 4-lane highway being built. It's what we, sort of like a circular road around the metro part of Guadalajara and adjacent lands. And you can see the bright green as a wildlife sanctuary. They have over 100 wildlife crossings on this 4-lane highway. It's probably the most mitigation of any road in North America, and no one even knows about it. And they were just going, they wanted to reconnect things. And primarily they had these five felid species from jaguar, then there's mountain lion, that's a cub of an ocelot, and then bobcats, and then jaguarundi. But they built over 100 crossings just for the 5 felid species primarily. And they even built 2 overpasses near the wildlife sanctuary. And as you can see, they used open fence so they don't have sound barriers that doesn't reflect the light at night from the headlights of the traffic. So not a perfect design, but they were enthusiastic and actually investing in building their first 2 overpasses, and this is what they looked like. And then here's another interesting thing. Again, when you just let people design for in their backyard, these are substantial underpass structures, right? You can tell by this photo on the left. And this is the kind of fencing they use to guide animals to the structures, which is, just woven fence, which is quite inexpensive. But what caught my eye and why I asked them to pull over, it was really shining in the sunlight. And if you can see on the right where my arrow is, there's all this metal along the bottom of this woven fence. And what I found out was they have rattlesnake crossings, that they were losing a whole bunch of snakes were getting run over on this section of highway. And so what they've done is attach stainless steel with a J cup on the top. So if snakes try to climb up and over, they hit the J and drop back down to the ground on the inside of the fence. And so they don't have any more snake mortality on this section of road. But it's just an easy addition to a crossing that I've just never seen. And when we think of, ectotherms that are, cold-blooded animals that are attracted to warmth, we know reptiles are very vulnerable to roads and are attracted to the warmth. So I just thought this was such a simple, easy design, and Mexico has the first rattlesnake crossing that I know of. So it was quite interesting and easy to replicate in other places. This is Argentina, their first overpass as well. So most of what I'm showing you are the first attempts in many countries. Again, I know Canada's been fortunate to have 20 to 30 years of experience now, but many countries are just getting on board with their first design. So this is for the golden lion tamarin. So they actually built an overpass for this road. And then this is the first structure for African elephants in Kenya. They built the highway with no crossing structure. And this is a known elephant corridor that connected two populations on the flanks of Mount Kenya. And so Save Our Elephants retrofitted with this, just a box culvert. That's all they could afford, but they put it in. And immediately they started getting females with their young using it. And within 3 years, the larger males were using it as well. So basically one simple underpass has reconnected the populations that were separated by that highway. Now Kenya, when they built their first railroad, I'm going to talk a little bit about rails now and some of the mitigation. This is the railroad that comes from the coast. Mombasa is the port city, and it goes to the capital, Kenya. Along the flanks of parts of the capital is Nairobi National Park. And so the railroad was going to go through the park. And so the mitigation, this was some more supported by China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the Kenyan government said, oh, if we go through the park, we have to lift the structure. So they literally, it's not just a crossing here or there. They lifted it across the entire passage through the national park. So you can imagine, again, the railway, for example, that's parallel to the Trans-Canadian Highway in Banff. If suddenly the Park Service said, well, we need to lift that all the way along through the entire park. And that's what, again, not a wealthy country like Kenya did for their wildlife to make sure that there was no impact or minimal impact by the rail. So this railroad went through two different protected areas, not only Nairobi, where they lifted it on the left, but National Park, but also Tsavo. But in Tsavo, they just created underpasses, and then they put in monitoring. And so they actually published a paper on this. And what they found is even these are quite high still. 30% of the elephants won't use the structures because these are narrower than the totally elevated rail. So even though they built, I think, 6 structures like this, they've seen very little use by a major chunk of the local population. So even when mitigation is put in, sometimes it doesn't work as effectively as possible. And again, this is Bangladesh now, and they just built this railway. It's just recently been completed. This was a drawing of what they contemplated as mitigation. The rail went through a wildlife sanctuary. They created 2 underpasses. A picture of one of the underpasses on the left. As you can see, it's nearly 5 meters high. We're now recommending, the Asian Elephant Transport Working Group is recommending 6 meters as a minimum for underpass structures. But at least they were able to mitigate the rail through the protected area. And this is the first Asian elephant overpass in the world, and it's Bangladesh building it. So again, these are not wealthy countries. They're taking out loans to build this infrastructure, but they're still trying to protect their biodiversity and their ecological connectivity. And there had been a very well-conducted pre-construction analysis of wildlife before the rail was built, and they knew where the elephant corridors were. So these are well-placed structures as well. Now I'm going to talk about going big. India is surprisingly becoming a world leader in wildlife crossings. And this is Rajaji National Park. We did a field trip here just last year. And on the right is a rail, and on the left is a new expressway they're building. And we're right on the edge of the park. We're in a sort of a river drainage, and as soon as you hit that forest, you're in the national park. And on the right is a sign. It says caution. But what they've done to effectively reduce mortality on the railway, which has been built for some time, they were killing 1 elephant per year for like a decade. And so to get to zero mortality, what they did is they're slowing, all trains have to slow down. Again, I don't know of any railroad that we're managing speeds to protect wildlife in North America, but they make it go down to 20 kilometers per hour through this area that they know the elephants frequent. And just by traffic calming, as they call the mitigation measure, they've stopped all the mortality. So a simple thing rather than a structure, they went with management of train speed. Thailand is also, this is again, their very first structures they're starting to build, and they built it at 3 kilometers long for one underpass and one overpass, where they're taking a 2-lane highway, turning it into a 4-lane highway. Sounds familiar to us here in North America. And it went between 2 protected areas, 2 national parks. And it's built now. I was able to go and visit this site as well. And they've had everything but tigers use it. The elephants are using it, but tigers are within 1 kilometer of using the crossings now. The same with Malaysia. This is peninsular Malaysia. Again, their structures are so large. It's just amazing. This is 400 meters long. Basically, they call it a viaduct. It's we would call it an underpass, but they lift the highway up on and just for a long stretch of highway. So, and again, they've recorded elephants' use of this area, but they don't have tiger use yet. And then again, Bhutan, I showed you this picture earlier. These are their very first crossings too. This happens to be a wildlife sanctuary that had elephants in it. And so they were just going to do a normal stream crossing kind of culvert. And they decided to build it, 8 meters tall with arch steel. And so they've had incredible passage rates of over 70% now. So these structures are working, and this has encouraged them. They're now building a whole series of other wildlife crossings in their country. So it's amazing how once they build a few and see how effective they are, they're starting to become standard practice in some of these countries. And this is Singapore, a relative urban area, but they had 2 parks on both sides of this expressway, and they retrofitted this overpass on it for relatively small animals, pangolins and civets. I believe that both are red listed on IUCN red list, so they're endangered. But as you can see on the right, they built a fence all the way across the structure. And so I asked them about that. I said, well, it seems to be counterproductive to why you build an overpass. And and they said, oh, there's feral pigs on one side of this road, and so we don't want them to get into the wildlife sanctuary on the other side of the road. And both the civets and the pangolins can get up and over the fence. So anyhow, I thought that was sort of interesting. But again, quite a large structure for such medium-sized animals. And now China's getting into some of their first structures in their country as well. And this is the first wildlife overpass. Again, a little bit different than anywhere else. It's a really flat and wide, broad structure, and it's still under construction, but it's on on a new expressway. But they have built underpasses. This is in Yunnan province, where again they have the Asian elephant, and so they have some underpasses. They elevated the highway and have a tunnel as well to leave the landscape undisturbed. So they've had some success. They've been monitoring this for quite a few years. This is probably the oldest structure, oldest mitigation measures. There's a series of them on this particular highway. And again, in India, when they build these structures, these underpasses, they're really building quite large, long structures. I always, in the US, we always argue over 40 meters versus 50 meters versus maybe, if we're lucky, to get a 60-meter wide overpass for the large animals. And these other countries are just building huge wildlife crossing structures for wildlife. It's just unbelievable. And I went to this is central India, where they have an excellent tiger population across this central India landscape. And we did the first it was a Global Tiger Forum was having its first infrastructure workshop. So we're really, and the field trip was out to their very first tiger crossing. And again, they're lifting the highway up for 750 meters long for tiger passage and other species as well. But they passed a law, they amended their Wildlife Act to include tiger corridors back in 1995. And so any road that goes through a tiger corridor adjacent to a tiger reserve, they invest on incredible mitigation measures to maintain that ecological connectivity for the species and for many others as well. And so this is another look at it. They'll remove that road, the 2-lane highway, and they're building the 4-lane highway to the while we were there for our field trip. Well, a colleague sent after they were finished, this is what it looks like. It seems so natural now, and within 1 year, our colleague at the Wildlife Institute of India is in charge of monitoring, Dr. Bilal Habib, and he sent us these photos from his monitoring cameras. And now it's been several years, and all the species and the vegetation's coming back, and a whole variety of all the species in the area are using it as well. So they're building them big. And so now, this is unbelievable. Now India's building 12-kilometer long flyovers for wildlife. They're building an expressway. Again, Delhi, the capital, Dehradun is to the north. And this happens to be a forest reserve adjacent to Rajaji National Park. And so they're just lifting the highway for 12 kilometers for wildlife movement under the new expressway. And I talked to an engineer, and I said, if you build a highway, four-lane highway on the ground versus this 4-lane highway in the air, what's the difference in cost? And they said 6 times. So they're willing to, invest that kind of costs to really build and impressive structures that really will guarantee ecological connectivity, both functional and structural connectivity. And now we think 12-kilometer is long. This is another national park in Assam, India, and we met with the engineer there too. And he's going to put 35 kilometers of this new highway. We on the left, I should first explain, Roads is a smartphone app to collect roadkill and live crossings. And we gave that and set up a local NGO to collect data for a year. Then we did a spatial analysis of the hotspots. We thought, and then we met with the state engineer that was the project manager. And as you can see, the top one is the dead animals, where it's statistically higher than the other parts of the road. And you can see that if you were to just focus on roadkill, you would build your structures in panel A. But if you looked at live crossings where it goes, remember, it's going from a 2-lane to a 4-lane highway. We didn't know they were going to elevate it when we were collecting the data. They would be different locations that would need to be mitigated. So we really think that a lot of the data collection needs to be more than just roadkill databases to really think about where your crossing structures should be built. So we met with the engineer and presented this data to him because he didn't have any data. And he said, oh, I'm going to build 35 kilometers. I'm just going to raise the highway. And the only place the highway follows Kaziranga National Park for 50 kilometers. 35 of that is now going to be elevated. It's not built yet. But the only place they brought it back down to the ground are the 3 entrance villages to the park, or else he probably would have elevated it the full 50 straight. So this is an engineering decision, by the way. It wasn't a Park Service, Parks India decision. So really impressive that how they really want to take care of their endangered species. Some other things that we don't do very often here in North America that I thought I'd share with you. This is from the Netherlands. They're putting water on top of some of their bigger structures for the smaller animals. We often design for wide-ranging, large animals that can move across it in minutes. We don't think about amphibians that might take days to cross such a big structure. And so the Netherlands actually tries to incorporate water on many of its crossing structures, which I think is interesting. And again, in North America, I haven't seen much of that. And of course, small structures, I know we're starting to focus more than just on our iconic big species, but I like the idea of these putting in the smaller structures don't work during the rainy seasons. Many of them mammals can't get through, so they put these little dry ramps that are lifted above the water in through the culverts. This was Roscoe Steele out of Missoula, Montana, made these structures, and they were placed in and monitored in Montana. But I haven't seen much of that as I go around the world either, where you can retrofit culverts for small mammals as crossing structures. And then this is from Japan. I just thought that was interesting. We don't think of our railroad, the rails themselves as barriers for wildlife movement. And so for their small reptiles that can't actually get up and over a rail, they put these very small little turtle crossings in for their railroad. So again, I don't think we're that creative. We're not thinking about all the species quite often when we're designing our roads and railways. Of course, you are in Waterton. I love taking this around the world and showing people. Barb Johnson from Parks Canada shared this with me, but the way they came up with the design and how many, this is the entrance road to Waterton for those that aren't familiar with it. And when they didn't have it mitigated, the tourists would run over all these salamanders when they do their mass migration out of where they overwintered in the pond you can see below the road, and they go up to the wetlands on the other side of the road to breed. And so they march across the road, and they would, up to over 40% of the population get killed on the roads. And so they put in these 4 or 5 crossing structures, and now it's, just minimal, down to 1 or less than 1% of the salamanders are killed on the road. Again, these are quite inexpensive solutions to provide for more than just large species, and not costly like a grizzly bear crossing, right? And another thing I don't think we're thinking about as much as the rest of the world is arboreal crossings. And this was, again, when I was at the Western Transportation Institute, we supported a grad student, and he was looking at northern flying squirrels because in Washington, they're on the west slopes, the owl was it's the primary base for the owl. So they wanted to see about the openings created by Interstate 90. And so he actually radio collared 17 of these adults, and then found that the furthest that they actually fly or glide over 2 years was 80 meters. And so I don't know if we're thinking about the gaps we're creating. I haven't seen many arboreal crossings in our part of the world. I know they do for the southern flying squirrel. North Carolina has built crossing structures for them, but here in the West, and I just don't see much attention being paid to what species are in the forest and which ones may need support for crossing these big forest gaps that are continuous, for long areas. So, and he did do a genetic study as well and found there was still mixing. What he did find is the most popular place where they crossed I-90, there was a median with a little vestige of forest left. And so they could actually go to the middle of the highway and then cross each 2 lanes at a time. And that by having that narrower gap, they had a lot, that facilitated crossing. So I don't think we're designing for them. And I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention, because when you go around the world, they're building structures, and again, these are inexpensive investments. Often they're just like a telephone pole with some things connecting. I'll show you how inexpensive it is. This is in peninsular Malaysia, Disney Fund, sorry, but the photo is for their funders, the Disney Conservation Fund supported the building of these structures. But all it is a cable with an old fire hose wrapped around it. And again, they have cameras set up, and many different primate species, all the primate species that are present in adjacent forests were using it. So didn't cost much, but solved that whole fragmented forest problem created by the highway. And this is another example of a very simple solution. So this was built by the British in Assam, India, back in the 1800s. And it's within this is a Hulak gibbon, the Hulak gibbon species. And this wildlife sanctuary is set up for them. But they had never crossed the railway since the 1800s. The populations had been separated. So a local conservation group, actually started twisting they'd climb the trees and start twisting the foliage together. And after a decade, the trees grew together, and they actually, because again, they have monitoring, they tried to build a structure, and it didn't work. The Hulak wouldn't use it. But when they rewove the forest canopy back together, now Hulaks cousins have finally met each other basically after 100 years. So it's a very inexpensive solution, but it is thinking about what's living in our canopies and what their needs are. And again, just some staff time is all it took to reconnect these populations. Now I want to talk just about not crossings themselves, but maybe this is some new ideas that are being generated for crossing policy that supports the construction of wildlife crossings in important places. And we did a study or a report for what's called the NCHRP, the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. And they wanted to know about wildlife crossings and the potential to bank them like we do wetlands, right? Wetland banking, where you create artificial wetlands, and then when you harm other ones, you have to provide twice as much wetland for the wetland that you harm. And so in the United States, it's called wetland banking because a private entity actually does that. And so we were asked to look at the idea of mitigation banking. And the point of this is, could we start building our crossings where they're needed most now, even if there isn't a highway project or a railway project, and bank that for when another project may be harming connectivity. So it's actually mitigation banking of wildlife crossings. And so we did this report. And one of the pilot or case studies in the report is California. And most people don't know this. I gave this presentation recently, and even in the US, it's not very well known. But they actually passed an act that does allow mitigation banking in California. So it's not a federal law, it's a state law. And I'm sure in Canada, you could do provincial laws, which are quite, because of the control of the roads, is authority for the roads is primarily provincial. And California did it and passed this law, and they actually built this crossing and banked it. So there's no highway project here, but it was an important place. They knew they needed a wildlife crossing sooner than later. So they built it here, and they're now banking those credits for another highway project in the future. So I thought that was an interesting thing that might be possible and replicable anywhere in other locations. The other thing is materials. You know how slow some of these structures are when they're built out of steel and concrete and in place. Sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year to build some of the bigger structures. They have to move traffic back and forth across the lanes, etc. And I was in a field trip in the Netherlands, and they're relying on what they call fiber reinforced polymer. Basically, it's glass strands wrapped in a polymer. And so the gray in this photo on the big photo, that's not concrete, that's FRP. And it's so light that it's modular. So that was brought in. They said the structure over the highway only took less than 1 working day. They first built the landing structures, and that didn't disturb traffic at all. They didn't have to stop or move traffic, in other words. But and then they could just come in on the back of a truck because it's so light and drop the structure in place. The second wildlife crossing that's ever been built with FRP is on the bottom left. And they did that in across a canal for wildlife. So, you know, this is, we always think about, you know, climate change and how species might be moving and adapting to changing environments. But we don't think about our structures as being adaptable in response to animal population movement. And when you think about it, this could easily be, again, with just regular construction equipment, you can move these in and out of the sites quite easy compared to concrete structure would be impossible. So we wanted to look at this. This is another close-up I took of the actual crossing. So again, that's FRP, that's not concrete. And so we got pretty excited about this and thought, and so we came to back home, and we actually have a project in California, and the US doesn't have the same manufacturer that made the ones in the Netherlands. We worked with one that makes FRP tub girders, they're called. And so we worked with California, Caltrans, to design the very first one based on FRP tub girders. And you can see on the bottom, let me just quickly go over it. So you can see on this image on the bottom right, those are the tub girders that are the structural things. Then across it is a deck of FRP. And so you would be able to swing a three deck piece in and build this in a matter of a day or two. And then they would finish it by putting they wanted to put concrete, a 4-inch layer of concrete, and then the soil on top of that. And the fencing and the sound barriers are all FRP as well. So it would have been the first FRP, and we had the design, finished it, and they costed it out because it was so innovative. It cost twice as much as standard concrete, and they didn't have the budget for it. So it's possible here. We have FRP manufacturers. We looked into it. Canada has FRP manufacturers as well. And we should really be thinking about this modularity notion. It is possible now. In other words, the materials exist. Maybe we should have, that was a 3-lane highway in California. Maybe we should have started smaller and shorter. It had never been built that long before, so they didn't have any tests or to base decisions on, so it was too high of a risk for the engineers. But if we would have went smaller, they have proof of that. And this is an example of structures that have been built. This was in Maine. This is more FRP design. So each of these tubes, the structural tubes, are FRP tubes filled with concrete. So there is some concrete in this. And then the decking is FRP as well. And these go in 3 days. This was built for traffic. So this actually carries traffic in Maine right now. But it is an FRP structure. So we actually have different FRP materials that are available for wildlife crossings. And we had tried the tub girder. Maybe if we would have went to this style, because it's been tested with traffic for wildlife, it would have been more acceptable and less of a risk. But anyhow, I just wanted to point out, we need to start thinking about modularity for our structures. And also, we know that concrete and steel are pretty high carbon. And this FRP is actually, they're starting to work on using for the fibers, natural products like flax and things like that. So it'll be more natural in the long haul. So anyhow, we need to think about new materials. That's some ideas. Maybe Canada can beat the US to the punch and build the first FRP crossing. But the materials are out there for anyone that's inspired to move forward with it. So that's my talk, and I just wanted to sort of show you what Canada has inspired, and I hope now you're seeing what the world is doing, and there might inspire you to think about some new techniques or new ways to build crossings for species in Canada. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Rob. What an inspiration, and what wow, how far we've traveled in just an hour. Thank you so much. We are a bit short on time, but we're definitely going to leave some time for questions. So you may notice, everybody, that some questions have been appearing in the Q&A already. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. If there's a question there that you'd like to see the answer to, give it a thumbs up. Marcy will order her questions in order of upvote and try to group things thematically as she sees fit. And I think that's all. I'm just going to pass it over to you, Marcy.
Yeah, great. So yeah, we have about 5 or 10 minutes, and Rob said he could stay later too. So I'll try to make do of yeah, all the questions you've all have asked. And yes, thank you, Rob. That was really awesome. So let's see how we can work through some of these questions. So there are a couple about funding. And so one of them is, can you give some examples of funding mechanisms other countries are using to pay for the crossing infrastructure? Some examples look like your projects where a road is already in place as opposed to being part of the cost of a new build.
Right. So yeah, funding always comes up. And so I would say in general, developed countries like say India or Korea or Japan, they pay for their own highways just like Europe and the West does, North America, where but the developing countries get loans from what are called MDBs, multilateral development banks, the Asian Development Bank, Europe has one, the World Bank, et cetera. And so it actually increases the size of their loan. That's why it's so amazing that developing countries are building such big structures, because they're actually taking a loan out to pay for that. When it comes to like India, it's cultural. They are just building it to protect their biodiversity. They pay for it by themselves as the cost of building this expanding infrastructure. And India is a good example. The one on Kaziranga National Park is the expansion of an existing highway, right? And that engineer wants to lift it for 35 kilometers. The 12-kilometer one that I showed you that was being built from the highway from Delhi to Dehradun, that is a new footprint primarily. So both are still incorporating it because these are such important biodiversity hotspots for India, Rajaji National Park and Kaziranga National Park. I didn't talk about the multitude of species, but for example, Kaziranga has the highest density of tigers in Asia. It also has, I think, 40% of the remaining single-horned rhinoceri, again, in Asia. So, and it has primates as well. So many rare species, relatively rare but endangered species. So they take that quite seriously, and they know the impact of the road. And that they would lift it for that long it's just mind-boggling to me, quite frankly. And it was an engineer, remember? And I asked him about, this is a little backstory too. When we shared the data, he said, this is great. This data is going to help me justify this, because he had no data at that time. He was building that without any data on wildlife. But subsequently, the Wildlife Institute of India is now doing it's not built yet, right? So they've been working on it for two or 3 years now, since COVID. So it just amazes me on that. But developing countries is what the Kenya Railway, again, that was China that's building that, and they give a loan. And the thing about, you've probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, China, sort of foreign policy to help it build infrastructure. They don't require any green safeguards, environmental safeguards. They let the recipient of the BRI loan determine what to do. So it was actually, again, Kenya government saying it's going to be costly, it's our loan, but we have to elevate that railway, or the public wouldn't have accepted a brand new railway through Nairobi National Park. So again, it's a cultural, it's really social, cultural, and they're willing to do that. And there's no, sometimes like, our famous one outside Los Angeles, the $80 million crossing on 10 lanes, most of that's private money. They got philanthropy to pay for that particular structure, most of that structure. So there's no philanthropy helping out in almost all the ones that I've been to that I showed you today.
So Rob, a related question from what you just answered, a related question would be that I'm not hearing you saying that there are financial incentives, so tied to these loans. So is there any incentivizing?
There's sometimes the banks, the multilateral development banks, have some safeguard requirements. For example, what they say is if you build a road or a rail with a loan from them through a protected area, then you have to have a net benefit, not a no net loss, right? So it's more, the mitigation becomes more expensive. So the incentive is it's going to cost you more if you harm some of the richest biodiversity protected areas, right? So that would be one type of sort of, I guess that'd be a negative incentive. Don't do it or it'll cost you more. But, you know, and then you look at the US, our last infrastructure bill that we passed, we have a standalone pot of money, $350 million for a wildlife crossings program. And the beauty of those kind of separate monies is this: you don't have to wait for a highway project. You know, sometimes your most important areas, you need to address them sooner rather than later. And under that new program here in the US, states are free to submit requests for crossings outside of active highway projects. And I think that's important.
Okay, here's another question. How can we respond to folks that say investing in wildlife crossings is too expensive, even when discussing, you know, cheaper approaches, or not necessary because the animals that would use them are not endangered? Deer, elk, moose. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument we hear, I've heard my entire career, right? And we probably will keep hearing about it. It's cost. It's always cost. And what I like to make, we've made the case here in the US, the cost benefit for wildlife mitigation, right? I'm sorry, for highway mitigation for wildlife. And that was the table I showed you that came out of that paper. And we could show that if the cost of doing nothing to having collisions with those large animals you talk that are common, like deer, elk, and moose, it actually costs more to society not to do anything, as all the injuries and damage to vehicles and, you know, emergency responses and all those costs that go into the collisions, to do nothing is quite costly. And to actually invest $1 million or $2 million for infrastructure lasts 75 years and ultimately does pay for itself over time. It's the initial cost, and it's always to the agency. That's the issue, right? It's the agency budget, even though all of society benefits from these, right? But if you start valuing what you're protecting, in other words, give a value to having grizzly bears on the landscape, and if they get hit, I told you we updated that. A grizzly bear, by the way, in the new report is like nearly $4 million. So anyhow, and we did wolves and all these in the new report. Marcel Hauser led that as well. So the point is, quite often it's just the cost of the mitigation that's being looked at, not the cost that savings by protecting things. The benefit, the cost of the benefits is not balanced with the cost of the mitigation. And so what we call cost benefit analyses, that's another thing we're trying to get as standard practice across different parts of the world. Now, the problem is the valuation of the animal, the different species, is not as common as what we have here in North America.
Okay, thanks. So here's a question that's looking at habitat enhancement being paired with the crossing structure installations. So the question is, how important is the management of habitat quality adjacent to crossing approaches and the efficacy of crossing structures and the mitigation of potential concentration of predation at crossing structures?
Well, predation is an easy answer. There have been 2 studies based on Banff, and it shows that it's not a prey. That's called the prey trap hypothesis was tested. And remember, each of the camera traps have a timer on the photos, so they know when the predator's there and when the prey are there. And anyhow, they published a couple papers, and so it's not a prey trap for the ungulates by, say, wolves in Banff. So that hasn't been a problem in other parts of the world either, is my understanding. So that's not a problem. What was I'm sorry, I lost track.
Yeah, that's okay. So really looking also too at looking at the management of the habitat quality or enhancing the habitat or on either side and around these crossing structures.
Yeah, so approaches are really important, right? Animals have to safely get to the crossing structures themselves. I got to tell you, in developing countries, often underpasses become places where people camp out, and and you have to have law enforcement basically, so it's left alone for the animals. In Wyoming, when they built their crossings, they closed to hunting the lands around the crossing structures for the first 2 years until they felt the animals, again, monitoring showed the animals were using it. This was pronghorn, mule deer, and elk, all hunted, right? And so they didn't want hunters hanging out around the crossing structures to dissuade use by the wildlife. And so you can manage it that way, and then the habitat quality itself. And the higher the quality, the better. And in fact, transportation agencies may not build a structure if the land next to the structure is vulnerable to development. So either it has to be public lands or conservation easements if it's private lands, just to be sure if they're going to invest $1 million or more for the crossing structure, that they don't see a subdivision next to it or something like that. So habitat land managed adjacent to crossing structures is really important, because they're 75-year investments,
Yeah. Okay. And here's another question that is interesting. Curious what you'll say. So can you address the use of escape structures in the fencing in some of the international projects that you featured? Just that there are so many different critters that may or may not, as you said with the example of the pigs, may or may not you want to use the crossing structure, but others that may need to have an escape.
Right. So if they get caught on the highway side of the fencing, how do they safely get away from traffic and the road? They're called jump outs and some escape ramps, different things. And, I haven't seen well, so the recommendation is for 5 kilometers of fencing, right? But that isn't standard practice right now internationally. Many of these countries won't build that kind of fencing. Fencing's very controversial in some countries. I have some pictures. In India, because the fencing will disappear if we would, I mean, they'll literally tear it down within 24 hours and scrap it, basically sell it for scrap. So they build concrete 2-meter high walls that they call fencing. And that's what directs animals to the structures. It's incredible in that it also creates a sound barrier and a light barrier. So it's sort of good when animals are right near the road, because they have a 2-meter high concrete wall there. So that's one type of fencing, and those do not have jump outs that I know of, the ones I've visited. And so a couple things here. If you have the long fencing, you will need escape ramps, right? They'll be trapped for way too long of a distance. The shorter ones you might get away with no ramps. I forget, for wide-ranging species, it's about every kilometer is usually the design for a jump out. Maybe less for less mobile species, but I have not seen very many of those yet in the international, especially I know that I've never seen an Asian elephant jump out. They're still worrying about the fence itself, the sturdiness of the fence. So that's controversial too, right? Building fence. Sometimes they use The Malaysia one I showed you, they tried electric fencing and they never maintained it. So they have fencing. As we know, maintenance is everything. We usually don't, we invest in building the structure and then we don't invest or set aside funds to maintain that structure over the long term. And so for elephants in that design, it was electric fencing, but no one maintained the electric fencing. So the effectiveness of the fencing went to zero. Sorry, I don't have better answers of great designs for different species.
Okay. So there's some interest in learning more about the mitigation banking, and I'm hoping, Rob, you can provide the link to us and we can send that out as a part of our follow-up materials to everybody. And then if you could please explain it a bit more. Someone was asking that, you know, they heard you say they built that they were building underpasses where there was no road. Or maybe you meant no construction projects underway, but to bank it in advance. So maybe you can explain it all a bit better because it seems to be a topic of interest.
Yeah, I'll explain some difficulties from our NCHRP report. So the notion is that we can't wait to mitigate some roads. And if we do invest in standalone mitigation where there's no highway project, could we bank that? Could we use what we did that increased connectivity as a mitigation measure? It's called offsetting, or right? It's not in the project area of another highway project that may be harming connectivity. And so that's what a bank is, right? You do something now, put it in the bank, and then they can use it. The benefits that accrued from that project for a highway project later that does cause harm. And so what it does allow an agency to do is start ticking off its priority crossing sites right away and put them in the bank for other projects that go through areas that aren't nearly as important to address. So that it addresses the urgency issue, or maybe it's a T&E species issue, a threatened and endangered species issue. But California actually banks that. The difficulty is this: what are they banking? Is it the reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions? Is it the frequency of animals crossing using the structures? And so the metrics of the bankable improvement to connectivity is causing some concern because it's very difficult. Is it just the length of the structure, the physical part of it? So that hasn't been settled. It's quite as you can imagine, we don't have a simple answer for that yet.
Right.
Yeah.
But your point is, rather than waiting for a twinning project or a repaving project or whatever might hold something up.
Yeah, most of our highways don't get retreated. It may be a repavement, a resurfacing every 25 years, maybe a little less. Concrete lasts longer than asphalt, et cetera. But nonetheless, it's decades, right? And so if you don't want to wait decades, this may be a way to be able to spend your money now and address the really problematic areas and bank that for future highway projects somewhere else, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess to respect everyone's time, Haley, I think there's a few questions in the Q&A. Rob, if we're able to provide your contact information, there's a few questions here I think where people would probably like to pitch you an idea or get your thoughts on something directly. And Haley, do you want to help close us out?
Can do. Thanks very much. Rob, thanks again so much for your time. Thanks in advance for the time potentially answering a few more questions. I know that this has been really inspirational for a lot of folks, and I could tell by the the activity in the chat and the questions being asked that there are people engaged in this sort of work. So this will be really helpful. Thanks. Thanks to our sponsors, without which we couldn't do this series. And then I just wanted to plug our next talk. So we're taking a break next week. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks, and we'll be welcoming Michelle McClellan and Lana Ciarnello, and they will be speaking about the trappings of success, the critical role of social carrying capacity in fostering long-term human grizzly bear coexistence, promoting safe and functioning wildlife corridors. So join us for that talk. It'll be really interesting. And see you in a couple weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rob. Great to have you. Great to have you be a part of this
Thank you.
session. And yeah, we'll figure out how we can get some follow-up information out to folks today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.